And finally, a look at modern and contemporary artists from Latin America. The first artists we should take a look at are the famous Mexican muralists, a very popular and important group in Mexican modern art history. We have three artists in this group, and we call them Los Tres Grandes, or the three great ones. This is Diego Rivera, right? Gabriel Orozco, and Onas Siqueiros. So Rivera, Orozco, Siqueiros, right? The three great ones, or the three grand Los Tres Grandes, right? Diego is probably the most famous. Diego Rivera is probably the most famous because of his sort of links to American capitalist funding, right? He's known for doing a lot of murals in America as well. But again, we'll look at all three and the different works they were doing. Diego Rivera, right? He did a lot of works about indigenous history. So this is how he got his start as a Mexican muralist, really looking at different subject matter related to indigenous history, or what they call indigenismo, right, within the study of art history. So again, thinking about like Olmec culture, Mayan culture, or in the case of the piece you're looking at here, Aztec culture. You'll notice I used this painting when we were talking about the Aztecs, and the reason why is because it depicts the city of Tenochtitlan, right, the great city of Tenochtitlan. So you see the lake in the background with the city built upon it, and then the people, right, bustling about, the leader on sort of this carriage throne being carried around. And so what Rivera did is he created these large scale murals for typically for public places like the National Palace or the chief government building, right, in Mexico City. And what he did was infuse them with the stories of indigenous Mexican culture to celebrate them, right, and for the people of Mexico to understand their shared heritage. In this piece, you can see sort of Quetzalcoatl, right, the feathered serpent flying in the sky. You can see temples, right? You can see other gods as well, and the people sort of going about their business, right? And so it's kind of a mashup, right, of all the indigenous history kind of laid bare in a mural form. And these are frescoes; these are wall paintings, so they're meant to be permanent, right, to the spaces that they're created for. Another piece that we can look at is the liberation of the peon. A peon is a small person, right, someone of no consequence. And this is a piece he did to depict revolutionary history, right? The history related to the Mexican Revolution and the Zapatistas and the other rebels who were functioning at this time. And we refer to this as subject matter related to Mexicanidad because it's not dealing with indigenous history anymore. It's dealing with the foundations, right, of Mexico and how Mexico comes to be as a country, right? The revolution and its background. So here you see like a common person who's been whipped and beaten, who has died, right? And then the Zapatistas, the rebels, right, covering him up and sort of honoring the sacrifice that everyday people had to make, right, during the Mexican Revolution. This is a Roscoe and a piece that he did for Dartmouth College. And it was a piece that Dartmouth wanted to document, as they put it, American history, and not just, the history of the United States of America, but Indigenous American history, right? So you'll notice it really deals with, the migration of the Aztecs, right? And then the Industrial Revolution that as it sort of progresses into the 20th century. And so the framing of this was meant to put a greater spotlight right onto Mexican history and the teaching of Mexican history right through the use of a mural. Orozco was part of creating the mural at Dartmouth. And then finally, you have Siqueiros, and these are some of the murals in the Chapultepec Castle, which again honor people from the Mexican Revolution. Also want to show you modern artist Frida Kahlo. This was Diego Rivera's wife. However, she was not a Mexican muralist, right? She was actually a surrealist. So she plays a lot with sort of the psyche, the interior mind, right? Dream theories, right? A lot of what the surrealists did. And she actually used herself usually as her subject matter. So you see her using a lot of self portraiture. And one of the reasons why we think she did this is because she actually was injured in a trolley accident in her youth and was bedridden for some time. So she probably just looked at herself as a subject matter, but it becomes somewhat of a classic thing that she does. And she often examines her Mexican heritage, right, in her pieces, right? She uses sort of the Mexican framing of herself, and she also uses often her accident as fodder for, what she's creating. And she said that, yeah, I'm using myself, but I'm also concealing myself. I'm putting on masks, or I'm putting on identities. I'm trying to figure out who I am right through the processing of these surrealist works. So again, a lot of her personal journey, right, comes into this. Her medical history comes into this, and her tumultuous marriage with Diego Rivera often comes into this as well, as she creates these different surrealist works. The two Fridas, for instance, was created after Diego Rivera asked her for a divorce. And so the right hand, you'll notice the right Frida in her hand is holding a little portrait of Diego Rivera, and it's like her heart's been ripped out. And so I often talk about this painting as, is the one on the right more the indigenous Frida, right? The more Mexican Frida. And then the one on the left is more sort of a European Frida, because her parents actually, her mother was Mexican, her father was German. So she often talked about being kind of stuck between this European, indigenous kind of identity and kind of playing with both. And then I often think of the one on the right being, sort of like the internal Frida, who's like, I'm hurt, I have a lot of pain, and then the one on the left being more so like, I'm trying to stop the blood flow, I'm trying to be okay. And surrealism, because it was about sort of this weirdness of the internal mind or the psyche or the dreams, right? It allowed for a kind of a canvas where you could explore things that weren't exactly reality, right? You could kind of play with the sense of a disruption from reality. Some contemporary artists to look at, right? I love showing you Jimenez's work. He works mainly creating, or worked, because he is deceased, worked mainly with making fiberglass sculptures, often very, very colorful pieces. And you'll notice he deals with very topical matters, even back in the 90s and the 2000s, when he first started to be seen for his work. Things like border crossing, for instance, are definitely about these hot button topics regarding, the relationship between the Mexican border and the U.S., right, and people coming in illegally. I went to the University of New Mexico for my doctorate, and so I got to see Fiesta y Arabe outside my art department every day when I went to class. And what I thought was interesting about it is that it's supposed to be sort of this playful, fun-loving, fiesta, fun kind of sculpture, but it's also kind of like odd and strange and sickly, and it's almost like this kind of like Day of the Dead mixed with like fiesta, and you can't really kind of make out, like, should you be like afraid of this sculpture, or is this sculpture something fun? This is Man on Fire, which dealt with the Aztec ruler Chaltitmoc, and his story related to Europeans coming in and wanting to find gold, right, and burning his feet. So notice again these fiberglass pieces, very colorful works, right, and then finally the famous Mustang at Denver International, which actually was why he died. He was working in the studio, and this piece was being cast in multiple parts, of course, because it's a very large scale sculpture. And one of the molds actually came unmoored and like pinned him against the wall of the studio and killed him. So very, very sad story about, his art essentially killing him. But again, this horse, it's kind of like, yeah, it's a symbol of the West, but it's this manic, crazed, kind of, it's kind of scary. You're sort of not sure what to do with Jimenez's work as a sculptor. It's this very postmodern, sort of view of how to make a sculpture. It's commemorative, yes. It's speaking to the West, but again, it's sort of scary and bizarre at the same time. I love always talking to you guys about Guillermo Gomez Pena and Coco Fusco, two of my favorite artists out there. They used to work together as a pair, and then about 20 years ago, they decided to part ways, and so now they do work on their own. They're primarily performance driven, right, as artists, so they're usually doing performance art. One of their famous early works was the two undiscovered Amerindians, where they literally were in a cage and had people interact with them. And then the Temple of the Confessions. The Temple of the Confessions was a work where they dressed up like Mexican saints, essentially, like Catholic saints, but in the Mexican looking tradition, right? And they were in these glass boxes, and people could confess to them their opinions on Hispanics or Latinos, right? And be honest about their stereotypes, right, and their fear. And they said they were shocked by the things that people would say to them. So a lot of their work is about like how do you uncover prejudice? How do you uncover, um, sort of the internal struggles that people have with other cultures, right? What are the things that are left unsaid? What is the fear that's underneath the surface? And we refer to this as the study of the other. This is why people can be imprisoned or enslaved, right? We tend to think of them as the other, right? And so we always say within humanities, if you want to not be afraid of somebody, go get to know them, because once you talk to them or eat their food or like participate in some kind of ritual or see how they live their lives, there's no way for you to other them anymore. You can't make them into the other because they're a real person, right? But they deal with the other, the idea of the other. The Amerindians piece, where they were in these cages, they'd go from museum to museum, and they said they were shocked by the way that people didn't seem to understand that this was performance art. And they said that told you all you needed to know about people and how they treated the other, as they put it. The fact that, they were looked at as lesser, that, people didn't really question them being in this cage, right? Being lower than them. And they said that was the scary part, even though there's plenty of signals within the presentation that they weren't the other. I mean, he's wearing boxer shorts, they would watch TV, right? So obviously they're not from like the middle of a jungle, like without knowing anything about culture. So they said we gave people these hints that, this was a joke in a sense, this was a performance, and it was surprising to them how many people didn't get it. Guillermo's Pena, when he went off to do works on his own, started really investigating what he called Chicano revisionist history, and dealing with, as he put it, Chicano issues. And he investigates like how does Christianity become so embedded in, indigenous thought, right? How does this become something that's accepted so heavily? So he does this crucifixion project where he dresses up like a mariachi and like crucifies himself, on the cross, right? Or he talks about Mad Mex, this collision of like cyborgian sort of imagery, Day of the Death imagery. He has sort of this sense of a tongue-in-cheek way that he deals with, as he puts it, the issues of the other. And he does a lot of work where he goes around to schools as a performance artist, and he'll teach classes on performance pieces and performance objectives. And he does a lot of work with stereotypes and how we are stereotyped often within cultures and how we operate within cultures. He actually does a project where he comes in to teach a class. So, say he'd come in to teach my class, and he would do what he called a reverse um, kind of idea of racial, sort of privileging. And he said that he always calls on like black males first, black males or black women second, Latin men, next, etc., and so forth down the line, where white men are last. And he says it's surprising, but not surprising at the end of the class where the white guys will go like complain to like a dean about it, about how they were being prejudiced, subjected to prejudiced behavior, right? And he's like, I'm trying to show them how like, black men and Latin women and black women feel a lot of the time in their lives, right? Where they are not the ones called on first. They are not the ones positioned at the top of the, as he puts it, the racial hierarchy. So he's very challenging, right? As an artist, and you may love or hate what he does. I think at least it's fascinating fuel for the fire. Coco Fusco, and again, you can go to her website that you see here. It shows a lot of her projects. When she started doing singular projects, she did a lot of work still about Latin identity. And this one's one of my favorites, where she's Queen Isabella of Spain. If you know Queen Isabella of Spain, she funded the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And what she's doing in this performance is she's signing deeds to land over to people. So what is this getting at? This idea of like, again, Spain coming and saying they owned American property. Like, people lived in America. Like, what are you saying? You own this place, right? But that's what Europeans essentially did. They colonized, right? So she's sitting at this table wearing a boat as a hat, and she's signing these deeds over to people saying, yes, here's your land as well, right? Again, it's a tongue-in-cheek but very, very deep commentary on colonialism. And I recommend, of course, going to Fusco's website to look more at her pieces. This is Dario Escobar, someone I recently kind of started looking at. And I like how he sort of takes modern art and uses like an installation approach. So he's kind of looking at installation art as a way that he can approach art making. And he plays with, as he puts it, typical stereotypes within Latin culture. So, soccer, for instance, right? He makes a lot of sculptures where he uses the idea of a soccer ball and kind of makes it into these large scale installations. So, he's like, I'm kind of playing with things that are familiar culturally, right? That people have seen kind of over and over, and then I'm kind of reinventing them. So, there's not a lot of social messaging here, like with Gomez Pena or Fusco, but I think that installation art is really where 20th century art is at. And so this is kind of, again, what's happening right now. Like, what are artists doing right now? I'd say they're not a lot of cultural commentary right now, but they're about like sort of taking things that are symbolic to people and kind of reinventing it.